As I prepared for this sermon, I had quite a few weeks to prepare for this sermon, and as I went through it, I kept on going through it and saying, well, this is how I envision this sermon to look like. What I have in front of me is not what I envisioned the sermon to look like. So bear with me as I try to go with the Lord's version, which I always should be doing. A passage like this, actually I'm going to turn on the fan because it's very hot here. Sorry, commercial break. So as I start a passage like this, you think of Jesus as walking on water as it's a pretty easy passage, and it is. It pretty much speaks for itself. You wouldn't think that Jonathan by design has given me the easy layups, and that's okay. I appreciate that, Jonathan, if that's the case, because the last one I did was on the Legion demon, and this one is Jesus walking on water. And both passages, you can almost read the passage and it speaks for itself. Now, one thing when we get to studying God's Word, we know that when we study God's Word, context is everything. Before we start covering this next passage, Jesus walking on water, I want to put in context what is going on with Jesus' disciples up to this point. Now, in Mark 1, we have the calling of the first disciples. We have Jesus heals the demon-possessed man. We have Jesus heals many more. And then Jesus heals the leper. In Mark 2, we have Jesus heals the paralytic, and he also calls many more disciples. More disciples, not many more. In Mark 3, we have Jesus heals man with a withered hand. And in Mark 4, we have Jesus calming the storm. In Mark 5, we have Jesus heals the man or drives out the demon, Legion demon, into the pigs. Then we have Jesus heals a woman suffering from bleeding. Jesus raises Jairus' daughter. And in Mark 6, Jonathan covered last week, Jesus feeds 5,000. So if you look at, now obviously up to this point in Mark, there's a lot of other things that have gone on. But I'm just looking at kind of the milestones that the disciples are looking at up to this point. There's some pretty big milestones. To see what Jesus had done up to this point in front of these men is astounding. And I would have loved to have a front row seat in all these cases. Up to this point, the disciples had a front row seat to most of Jesus' miracles. They saw his power and authority over sickness, disease, and death. They saw his power and authority over the spiritual forces through the driving out of demons. They saw his power and authority over nature by calming of a mighty storm. They saw his power and authority over physical needs in many ways, including the feeding of the 5,000. They had a front row seat of what was going on and to see Jesus' full power. They got to see him preach firsthand. They got to sit beside him in a boat. They had first-hand contact with Jesus. That would have been awesome. Now on to this week's passage. Let's open up in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you for your holy word. I thank you for the passage that we're going to study today. Lord, I thank you for Travis and Naomi again leading us in such awesome worship. Lord, we need to come to you and worship and adore you. And we did that this morning, and I thank you for that opportunity. Lord, as we go through this passage about you, with you walking on water, let's look at what we can learn. Let's look at what we can apply. Lord, in many circumstances in our life, we are afraid. We worry. Help us to look at that today. Help us to take a closer look at what we can do to remove that from our lives. What we can do to reduce that in our lives. And what we can do to trust you more. In your holy precious name. Amen. Today's passage is Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida, which, while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up to the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. So as I was saying, the disciples had plenty of opportunities to see that Jesus was the Son of God, to see his power on full display, to see his authority on full display. Now, Jesus walking on water is covered in 3 of the Gospels. It's covered in Matthew, chapter 14, 23 through 36, Mark, which we just covered, 6, 45 through 56, and John, chapter 6, verses 16 through 24. Now, John only covers it briefly. Matthew and Mark tend to give a little bit more details. Now, only Matthew includes Peter walking on the water with Jesus. We really won't be covering that today. If you want to read it on your own, have at it. We're really looking at it from Mark's perspective. We will look at the 3 Gospels to better understand this amazing miracle. But now, just prior to Jesus walking on water, as Jonathan covered last week, he fed 5,000. Well, that's 5,000 men, which means he most likely fed, Jonathan gave numbers of at least 10,000, and I've seen numbers from 15 to 25,000 with women and children. Regardless, if it was 20 people or 20,000, it was truly an astounding miracle, and to be able to feed that many people. So I don't think the numbers are important. Obviously, if it was 500, it's still a lot of people to feed with the amount of food that he had. So I don't think we should get caught up in the numbers, but either way, it must have been pretty astounding to be like, "Hey, look at the basket's full again," and hand it out again. "It's full again." And then to have 12 baskets left over. Truly an amazing miracle. Now, in the Gospel of John, it shows more clearly what is going on with the crowd that Jesus just had fed. In John chapter 6, verses 14 through 15. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again into the mountain by himself. This passage in John helps us to understand why Jesus sent the disciples away. The crowds wanted to make him king by force. They saw Jesus heal the crowds, saw that they fed them. The crowds were only interested with meeting their own physical needs, and were not interested in worship Jesus as they ought to be. They were interested in being healed. They were interested in being fed. Their bellies were filled. They were basically wanting to be a full-service McDonald's all the time for them. They wanted him to meet all their needs, and now that included them to take them out of the tyranny that they've been fallen under Roman rule. Back in Mark, it says, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go with him before him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. Why would Jesus make them? The fact that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat strongly suggests that they were reluctant to leave, or perhaps argued with Jesus about leaving. To make someone do something pretty much means that it's going against what they want to do. This helps us understand better what the disciples may have been thinking and what they were going through. I believe Jesus sent them away because he felt they were going to get caught up in the same thing the crowds were getting caught up in. The crowds were only interested in what Jesus could do for them. This included making him king by force. Jesus wanted them to be far from this, so he made them leave. Again, the crowds were not interested in truly worshiping Jesus as they ought, to worship him with the heart of a servant, to worship him as a servant of Christ. So now the disciples who are gone, what does Jesus do? In Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 30, well, it's not 33. I'm not going that far, 23. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side. While he dismissed the crowd, after he had dismissed them, he went up on the other mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone. Obviously, when they're writing this, they're making sure that they're making it abundantly clear, Jesus was not on this boat. They want everyone to understand, Jesus did walk on water. He wasn't anywhere near this boat. He let the disciples go ahead of him. Now, what was Jesus praying? We really don't know. But if I was forced to guess, based on what was going on, if I was forced to guess, he was interceding to the Father on the disciples' behalf. He wanted them to have a change of heart. He wanted them to stop getting caught up in what the crowds were getting caught up in. As I mentioned earlier, the disciples had a front row seat. They knew exactly what was going on. They knew all the power that Jesus had. He showed all his authority. And yet they were still having a hard time getting it. My guess is he prayed that these 12 lunkheads would finally get it. And my prayer is that I, myself as a lunkhead, and my fellow lunkheads will get it too. Now, I'm sure some of you may be thinking that I'm making up words again, or maybe you're thinking, did he just call me a lunkhead? Well, first, on the made-up word front, I didn't make it up. This one is real. A lunkhead is usually male, so that doesn't freak all you women. Is someone who lacks creativity, is very slow on the uptake on understanding situations, and is not well-read or well-informed. As far as the second one, yes, I did call you lunkheads. I will try to cover that more later. I will be calling you names later on. Same name, but I will continue to call you lunkheads. Now, no disrespect intended to the apostles, no disrespect intended to anyone here. But it sure appears that they were being lunkheads. And oftentimes, so are we. As we read through the Gospels, we see many accounts of them being lunkheads. Just ponder a moment examples of times that they were being lunkheads. And now ponder a time that you fill that description. Might be a daily thing, might be a weekly thing, might be multiple times in the day thing. I'm often a lunkhead. I'll admit it. Slow on the uptake. Maybe it's slow on the uptake as the Lord's trying to teach you a lesson. Maybe it's you're not understanding what the Lord has intended. Maybe you're not trusting Him as you ought. You're not putting 100% trust in the Lord as you ought. Back to Jesus. When He was perhaps praying to the Father on the disciples' behalf, He was praying for the disciples perhaps to praying for their hardened hearts. Sure, He was praying for them because He loves them. Maybe He was praying for them because He knew they were in trouble when they were fighting the waves, the wind and the waves. Maybe He was praying for the future of His ministry was on that boat and in danger. That boat sinks, what happens? We probably wouldn't be standing here today. Now, obviously, that didn't happen because God had a plan. But through those 11 of the 12 men, we're here today. In John chapter 6, verses 25 through 26, when they found Him on the other side of the lake, they asked, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" Jesus answered, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me, not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill." Again, I am pretty confident that Jesus was praying for His disciples. He was praying for God to draw them and worship Him as they ought. They needed a heart change. Now in the story, the timing of what's going on when they're rowing is important to understand what's going on. So let's cover the timing of how the night was divided into 4 watches or shifts. First shift or watch was from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m. Second was 9 p.m. to 12 a.m. Third was 12 a.m. to 3 a.m. And fourth was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. Jesus came out to them in the 4th watch. Now it doesn't say exactly when they left, but if you go through the time frames from the time that the crowds were dismissed right prior to that they left off in the boat, they were going on about a 4-mile journey across the lake. It wasn't a very far journey, but they just got caught. They just got caught in the winds and the waves, and they were basically getting nowhere. And from the time that they left to the time that Jesus got to them, we're looking at bare minimum of 6 hours and between 6 and 9 hours. Okay. Now, has anyone here gone out rowing in a boat? Okay. Done it for more than an hour? Okay. Now, after that hour, you getting a little tired? Okay. Can you picture doing that for 6 to 9 hours? In rocky, windy, fighting the waves. Quite honestly, probably pretty fearful. They're exhausted. They're discouraged. They're afraid. A lot of things are going through the minds of the disciples. Now, oftentimes, we, as lunkheads, or as the disciples are lunkheads, when they're in danger, they're discouraged, they're exhausted, fearing when this might end or how it might end. Now, oftentimes we get discouraged. We're exhausted. We're fearful of how things may pan out for us. Maybe it's in a ministry that we're in and there's things going on in that ministry. Maybe it's in a relationship or lack of a relationship. Maybe it's what we do for work or lack of work. Maybe it's money. Maybe it's just uncertainty about the future. Obviously, the list goes on and on and on. Let's go back to Mark and see what Jesus' answers to this would be. In Mark chapter 6, verses 49 to 52. But when they saw him walking on the water, they thought he was a ghost. They cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed. So the first reaction when they saw Jesus is to scream like a little girl. That's what it was. They cried out. Now, the same disciples that had seen Jesus do countless miracles, feed thousands, drive out demons, etc., and their first reaction was to scream. Now, keep it in mind, they were exhausted after a long day, and then they had a long day with feeding the 5,000. They got into the boat. They're probably pretty angry that they're in the boat, that Jesus sent them away. And after many hours of rowing, fighting the storm, and their first reaction is to scream. Now, just think oftentimes when we're exhausted, or things aren't going our way, or we're fearful, maybe we don't react quite the way we should. We don't necessarily put our 100% trust in the Lord. That's what I might want to challenge you guys with today. Now, they thought they saw a ghost, so they have a good excuse, I guess. Now, the term ghost in the Greek is phantasma, which refers to an apparition, a creature of imagination, and it's where the word phantom is derived from. So, now if you're in the middle of a lake, windy, and you kind of see a person, your first thought isn't going to be, "Hey, that's Jesus coming at me." Your first thought is like, "What the heck is that?" Now in verse 50, they hear his voice, and the first thing he says is, "Take courage," or "Take heart. It is I, do not be afraid." In spite of the raging waves, the waves battering the boat, being fear-stricken, they all immediately recognized their master's voice. It was courage from Jesus that the disciples were receiving, and that Jesus was freely given. When it comes to fully believing, when it comes to not being fearful or afraid or perhaps anxious, the disciples, I would have to say, were lunkheads. I would have to say that we are to many times guilty of also being lunkheads. There's no other command in the Bible that is repeated more often than "fear not, do not worry, do not be afraid." They all pretty much mean the same thing. It is said that "fear not," or similar phrases, are present in the Bible 365 or more times. That's one for every day of the year. That's a lot. The reason it's in the Bible so oftentimes, and the command is over and over and over and over again, because we have fear issues. We have control issues. We have faith issues. As servants of Christ, we need to trade our worries, our fear, for peace that only comes from the Lord. When we worry, and when we're afraid, we're telling the Lord, I'm not willing to put my 100% trust in you. I got this one. I like control, and I like to know what's going to happen with this one. Now, I believe that our trust in the Lord, lacking in this area with fear, anxiety, is prevalent in the church. It's prevalent in believers. It's prevalent in society. And we justify ourselves. Why would it say over 365 times, do not fear? Because they want us to get it. They want us to not fear, not be anxious. But it's so hard to let go sometimes. The rest of this sermon, I'm going to go over quite a few verses over fear. Not going to talk much about them. Just going to go over, I'm not going over 365, so send it down. It won't be that bad. It's about 100, no, I'm just kidding. Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. That's an assurance, people. We have God on our side. He wants to take that. He wants to trade our anxiety. He wants to trade our fears for peace. He's saying, I have this. Do not be dismayed. I will strengthen you and help you. Psalm 56, 3-4. When I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God whose word I praise. In God I trust and am not afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Now, to say something like that, for David to say something like that, is that he's living it there. What can mere mortals... He's basically using logic and saying, what's the worst going to happen? God's on my side. He has it covered. Worst in the storm, they're rowing. What's the worst that happens? The boat sinks, they go to heaven. Woo! Right? But we imagine things from our fleshy side and say, we want things our way. What was that Burger King commercial? You want it your way? Have it your way, have it your way. That's the way we like it. I won't start singing it. Philippians chapter 4, verses 6-7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Guess what, people? When we're not living this out, we're lunkheads. That's what we are. We're showing that we are not willing to trust in the Lord. John chapter 14, verse 27. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. It's a good deal. I'll trade my fear and my anxiety, and I'll trade it for peace any day of the week. It's funny that as we're getting ready for the sermon, I print it all out in big font so you can put the person in the back and read it from there. It's good for the blind. I went to go print it, and the printer was jammed. I'm like, okay. So then I'm coming up with contingency plans. I send my kids to get Abby's tablet so I can read it off the tablet. Then I'm thinking, okay, Lord, now I have to read glasses to be able to read off this tablet. And the Holy Spirit just said to me, you're getting anxious about this. And I just prayed about it. And all the anxiety was gone. And Jonathan came to the rescue and fixed coffee. But our first instinct is to go to anxiety. Our first instinct needs to be running to Him. That's what our first instinct is. Should be. Now, as things come up, if we automatically go to prayer, how much does that diffuse things? I was completely at peace. Another example, Kelly and I, and the kids went to Oklahoma. And before I'm going on the trip, I'm getting anxious about it. Lord, how am I going to pay for this? Lord, am I going to have enough time at work, from work? Will I be able to get work ready so I can leave and it's going to be, my job can still be completed while I'm gone? List of anxiety. And the Holy Spirit just led them. It's like, what are you doing? What are you doing? Put it at my feet. And I can tell you, I was anxious about being on the bus. I asked many of you guys to pray for me because I was being anxious about being on the bus. And I was trying to get out of that anxiety. That's a long time to be on a bus with that many teenagers. It was awesome. But the Lord provided 100% of paying for that trip. Work went fine. I had the time off that I needed. Every bit on the bus, it was a pleasure to be on that bus. It was hot. There was times it was hot. I was a little tired, but it was a pleasure to be on that bus. It was ministry in motion all the time, and just having fun, and we played goofy games on the bus. It was just a good time. And the Lord blessed that trip every step of the way. And because I traded my anxiety for peace. John chapter 14, verse 27. Peace I leave with you, and my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verses 7 through 8. For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, or of me, His prisoner. Rather, join with me in His suffering for the gospel by the power of God. Many versions have that verse as does not give us for the Spirit God gave us does not make us fearful. He gives us power. He gives us the tools to succeed. John chapter 1 verses 4, 1 John chapter 4 verses 16 through 18. And so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in him. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we may have confidence on the day of judgment. In the world we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear has to do with punishment. And the one who fears is not made perfect in love. You look at a verse like this, it's a powerful reminder of the love that Christ had for us and the love that we need to reciprocate. That there's no fear in love. And if we're running to Jesus as we ought, we're trusting Him as we ought, that drives out all fear. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Maybe the disciples, while they were rowing, they should have been quoting this verse. Might have helped. The top in that picture, it says, fear not, His invitation to trust. He wants us to trust in Him fully. He wants us to let Him have 100% control and be on the throne of our lives. But it isn't. Only a few more to go. Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. We look at verses like this, but yet we still worry. I'm covering a total of 19 verses on fear and worry today. Only have a few more, like I said. But when you look at these verses, there's constant just reminders that we need to relinquish control over to the Lord. But we love our control. We want to know what's going on with that relationship. We want to know what's going on with that ministry. We want to know what's going on in the future. But it's not for us to know. If we're servants of Christ, if we're claiming that we're a servant of Christ, what rights do a servant have? We don't have any rights. We're putting our full trust and control in our Master. But are we? In Luke chapter 12, verses 20 through to 26. Then Jesus said to His disciples, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothes. Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap, they do not store away, they do not have storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to your life? Since you cannot do this little thing, why do you worry about the rest? Verse after verse after verse, it's telling us why the heck are we worrying? We have no reason to worry. We have God on our side. Fear not, learning to trust in spite of fear. And that list just goes on and on. Death, suffering, future, loneliness, time, children, the unknown, friends, money, relationships, illness, children, security, rejection, aging, money, war, who's going to be the next president. The list goes on and on and on. We live in a world that is changing, and it's a scary world. You see what's going on in France and Germany, and what's the next news that we see? We live in a world that's driven by fear. But we're more than conquerors, and we need to be living that way. Psalm 27:1, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? That second sentence, the Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I fear? If we're trusting the Lord, and He is the stronghold of our life, there's no room for anxiety. There's no room for fear. Deuteronomy 31:6, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. We have promise after promise after promise, assurance after assurance after assurance that we need to be trusting God. Isaiah 41:13-14. For I am the Lord your God who takes hold of your right hand and says, do not fear, I will help you. Do not be afraid, you worm Jacob. Little Israel, do not fear. For I myself will help you, declares the Lord, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. When it comes to handling things like fear or anxiety, I think it comes down to just one thing: trust. In who we put our trust in. When we are fearful, we're not trusting God. When we're anxious, we're not trusting God. Are we willing to trust in the Lord and give Him full control? People, let's not kid ourselves. This is an epidemic in churches. This is an epidemic in believers. I don't think it's a bold thing to say that most, if not all of us, struggle with this. But we tend to want to just play church and say everything's great. I'm living the life as I ought to. But are we? Again, we like things our way. We like things, we love to be in control. We want things to pan out the way we want them to pan out. Fear and anxiety mainly come because we don't have control. We don't know what will happen next. As servants of Christ, we need to put all things at Jesus' feet, trusting 100% in Him. When you think of the song, All to Jesus I Surrender, it's not some to Jesus I surrender. It's not a little bit of Jesus. I'm holding back 10% to Jesus I surrender. It's all to Jesus I surrender. Picture on the top, let go or let God. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5-6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your path straight. Now, again, this doesn't say trust in the Lord with some of your heart. It says all your heart. It's hard not to lean toward our own understanding. It's hard not to try to take control of that situation. It says, and lean not on your own understanding. Again, we like things our ways, people. We are a people that have trust issues. Are we trusting the Lord with all our heart? The fact is, as I said earlier, we are lunkheads just like the disciples. A lunkhead is usually male. I'll take that away. I was going to take it away, but I had to cut and paste exactly what it had so you guys didn't think I was making it up. A lunkhead, usually male,